Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Co-host today is Daniel McAdams, and Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good.
All right.
We want to revisit a strategic part of the world that we are concerned about, and of course that is the Middle East, in particular Syria. But you know, it's been a couple months now that there was some agreement that there would be peace talks and a ceasefire, and the Russians tried to promote this and try to set the stage for this. And they made a token exit from Syria, but promised that if things get bad, they may be back. And we agreed to the ceasefire. But sometimes ceasefires are not always well intended. They're strategically committed on each side to maybe have a breathing space to get themselves in better position, and I'm sure that has gone on both sides. But there's more than both sides in this thing. You know, we have the Syrian government, we have the rebels who want to get rid of them, and there's several factions there, and they go and come. Then we have the Russian government, we have the U.S. government, we have the Turkish government, we have the Saudi government going on. So my guess is that this ceasefire hasn't moved us to closer to peace, permanent peace. But there's articles now and hints now that it's getting ready to explode again, that we maybe never stop sending weapons, and we may be getting ready to send a lot more. So where do we stand on there? Is there any hope under today's conditions and our current foreign policy of seeing peace breaking out very soon in Syria?
Well, you know, the ceasefire was very specifically targeted. It was the government, the Syrian government, and also those rebels who were considered not a terrorist group. That would mean ISIS and Al-Qaeda's affiliate, the Al-Nusra Front. They were not part of the ceasefire. Mm-hmm. That means that they were fair game, and they would also attack the Syrian government at the same time. The problem has been that the so-called moderates who are part of the peace fire have increasingly integrated themselves into the Al-Nusra Front's fighting structures. And even Mark Toner, the State Department spokesman, admitted a few weeks ago that there's intermingling going on between the moderates and the Nusra Front. But you know, we decided to talk about this because we both read a Wall Street Journal article yesterday, U.S. readies Plan B to arm Syria rebels. And the article is actually quite remarkable because it demonstrates, and we've seen it elsewhere, that throughout this ceasefire, the U.S. has taken the opportunity to provide a lot of arms to the so-called moderates, 3,000 tons by one estimation. And but this is the logic is insane. And this readying a whole big new shipment, but they only will be available if the ceasefire fails. They'll give these weapons to the rebels. That's like telling a kid, you only get a cookie if you don't eat your broccoli. The kid's gonna not eat it.
But I bet our industries have already manufactured, and they already for the sales, or they have already sold them out. You know, it's difficult for me to keep up with all the factions, because some days ISIS is up and Al-Qaeda's down, and some days Al-Qaeda's up, ISIS is down, and sometimes they're both together. So I can imagine a lot of people, even those like that watch this program, they keep up with this. You can't help but get a little bit confused. But I think there's a good reason and an excuse for some of the confusion when you understand that the CIA backs one faction of rebels and the Pentagon backs another one. I mean, how could anything so absurd come up like that? But of course, I think people that are informed say that doesn't surprise me. You know, they're just in the business of chaos and agitation and all this pragmatism. But the goal is always, you know, to usher in a fair democratic state and get rid of the particular leader that they don't like. Mm-hmm. But how in the world could they get by with this, where one hand of our government doesn't even know what the other hand's doing, and they're on two different sides, and then we wonder why we're not doing well?
It's even worse than that, actually. A couple of weeks ago, the CIA rebels were actually fighting the Pentagon's rebels. So it really descends into the theater of the absurd. But the problem is that the CIA and the Pentagon have two different agendas in Syria. They really are at odds. The Pentagon, and you know, we've talked about this and we almost make a joke about it, the Pentagon's program only trained a very small number of rebels at a huge expense. But the Pentagon has been more diligent about vetting these rebels. and they've thrown out a lot who have sympathized with terrorism. Well, the CIA is not bound by such daylight shown upon their covert actions. So they have actually provided, I would say the CIA's agenda is definitely not anti-ISIS. It's primarily anti-Assad, and I think that is evident by the kinds of weapons they provided. They provided TOW missiles, which are only effective against the Syrian government's tanks. The MANPADS, the shoulder-fired missiles, which they shot down 2 Syrian Air Force planes over the past couple of weeks. And even the Soviet-era Grad rockets, which are used to fight against the Syrian army. So the types of weapons, I think, tells us a lot about where the CIA is focused, and the Pentagon has a different agenda.
You know, the CIA is more part of the deep state. You know, nobody really knows what's going on with them. And I think that's part of the problem. The Pentagon is supposed to be more transparent, but it's just about close to insanity of what we're doing there. But there have been some good writers on this. Van Buren, I think, in particular, points out, when did this all start? Has it been going on for a long time? Well, our intervention has been going on for a long time. We've been intervening too often, too long. And some people can date us back 100 years. I mean, why did we intervene even in the Spanish-American War? But in recent times, they say that the real introduction to this failed policy that we're suffering from right now really came up in 2003, even though there were a lot of things that we were doing wrong before that, the Persian Gulf War and the bombing and all these things led up to it. But the claim is that 2003 invasion, thousands and thousands of troops to bring order to this region has created this. And the one thing that those who oppose us philosophically will never concede, never even entertain the idea that what were conditions like before we were really involved over there versus what has happened since. And yes, I think there's always been some jihadists out there waiting for the day to wake up the radicals, just as there are some people who believe in the Christian Crusades in many ways, using force. But the history is so clear. Where was the Al-Qaeda and where was the ISIS before we got involved? So there has to be this motivation. It's the same way they refuse to look at this whole idea of blowback. It can't possibly be related to our policies, but they say it can't possibly be. This is a religious thing, and this is because they believe that we are free and prosperous, and then they go to fight in this thing. I don't think many people are thinking about those issues when they're in these militias shooting at each other and trying to get rid of Assad.
Yeah. And I think we talked about earlier that, Van Buren and a lot of writers have traced the origin of ISIS to a particular prison in Iraq where the U.S. dumped a lot of the ranking people in Saddam Hussein's government. They dumped them in there. And I think anyone with half a brain would understand how dangerous it is. These guys had enjoyed all the perks of political power, and all of a sudden they're in a really awful prison, and they're all hanging out with each other. Can you imagine them not plotting, here's a way we can get back power? It's just so absurd. But we're in the midst of a real revisionism when it comes to what actually happened in the Middle East. Because, for example, Hillary Clinton said this past week, ISIS's rise was only due to the fact that Assad left a vacuum in his country and enabled, what leader would purposely say, I'm going to give up a bunch of my power so that this radical terrorist group would come in? It's just so foolish, but of course the media repeats it.
And back to this prison issue, I think it's been a great motivator, especially when it turned out where the pictures were shown about the humiliation and the way they were treated, and they were suspects. They were never, but everybody in this country said, oh no, they're criminals, they're the ones who committed these crimes. And so it's never been that they were suspects and they had to be captured and arrested. But we had Abu Ghraib and we had the abuse at Guantanamo. Pictures were shown, and this was a strong motivator. But even if we conceded, which I will not, concede to those who say that torture on a rare occasion can be very useful, so therefore if we torture 5,000 people, but we'll get information on one. They justify this. But even if you set that aside and say that just being there, getting involved illegally, and then having these prisons and seeing what's happened here as a motivator. It's just tremendous for influencing young people who are sick and tired of what's going on, and some of the people who see the abuse and the unfairness of so many innocent people being killed, and how many civilians are killed in Iraq. Not 1,000 or two, hundreds of thousands.
Maybe a million.
Yeah. I mean, so they don't want to look at it. They will not question policy, and that to me is the only thing that can happen. So the one individual, I think it might have been Van Buren, stated, well, what if we ask the candidates more about it? Because he stated that all the candidates right now, everybody wants to fight, and kill them all, and that'll solve the problem. But what if there's a chance, and I think there's a big chance, that what we're doing is making things worse for us, worse for the people, worse for the cause of peace, and yet nobody dare answer that, because then you're a wimp, you're un-American, you're not supporting the troops and all that nonsense, and yet all the failure, all the troops and all the money and all the deaths up until now. So what are they going to do? Are we having change in our policy, or do you think there's a reactivation of more militarism?
It really is like the classic definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. Yet another program to deliver weapons. A couple of weeks ago, the Pentagon announced yet another program to train rebels. They're going to keep doing the things that haven't worked, and hope they'll have a different result. But you said something earlier that struck me, how people feel in these countries. And the deaths, the mayhem, losing family members, that's horrible. But even on a lesser level, think about, even if Assad was not a great guy, not the greatest Democrat in the world, people had a normal routine in their lives. They lived relatively normal lives where they went to their work, they went to church, they did what they do, they visited their families. All this has been completely disrupted. So even people not personally touched by death have found their entire world turned upside down. We've never had to experience that in this country, and people are so hesitant to put themselves in the shoes of others. What would it be like if everything you've known your whole life is suddenly completely disintegrated?
You know, and of course, they're using what's going on over there because there is plenty of abuse of Christians now because of the conflict. But did they ever ask the question, under Saddam Hussein or under Assad, under the Iranian Ayatollah, were all the Jews and the Christians abused? No. It comes, the very thing that they use for the motivation for us to go over there even more so are the very things that came about after we got there. But that is unacceptable. No, it's innate, and they'll find something to say, this is what they're dedicated to, the destruction and the killing of all Christians.
Well, you know, they just liberated a village in Syria that had been a Christian village that was occupied by ISIS, and they discovered a mass grave of Christians. You know, so obviously under ISIS, this is not a paradise. But what's really telling, and is actually disgusting, is that when the Syrian army, with the help of the Russians, retook Palmyra, which had been occupied by ISIS, and remember, they blew up all of these ancient artifacts. When they finally liberated them, there was several press conferences where they were trying to get the spokesman of the State Department and the Pentagon to admit that at least the Syrian government is better in control of this than ISIS, and they refused to do it. In fact, the Pentagon spokesman, John Kirby, said, well, it's like going from the frying pan into the fire. You know, from ISIS back to the Syrian government, which for all of its faults did not have mass graves of Christians. Nobody's even suggested that they've ever had that.
You know, the theoretical question that should be asked all the candidates is, you know, what are you going to do now? Everybody's out, everybody's committed themselves to destroying ISIS, but what if the quickest way to destroy ISIS is to destroy the incentive, of course, and we change our policy? But, you know, even that isn't acceptable in the debate, because they'll come along and you'll hear this. They say, well, they didn't have an end game. I argued for the case of, if we're going in there, we have to have an end game. Total victory, you know. Send in 500,000 if 300,000's not enough. So it's always a technical thing. It's not that there's no end game. But it turns out that if anybody could learn anything about Vietnam, a little country a third world country. Well, we had over 500,000 people there and lost over 60,000 Americans died there and killed 1 million Vietnamese. In the end game, well, we didn't have a good end game. Well, we didn't have a good entry game. That's the problem. What are we going in there for? And they said, well, we got to get rid of these bad guys. But they have no concept of, of the idea that the current government may be better than what you're going to suggest. So if there's imperfections there, to assume that our government and our allies going in there and more disrupting it because they're not exactly the kind of, they don't solve their problems and they violate civil liberties, that we have to go in there. So if we're concerned about civil liberties, my answer to that is, let's deal with the abuse of civil liberties here in this country, and maybe then somebody would want to emulate us, but we don't have a very good record ourselves, and I think that's the big problem.
And you know, over the weekend, President Obama was asked about what is his biggest regret while he's in office? What does he think his biggest mistake was? And this just demonstrates how little anyone has learned, even the Nobel Peace Prize winner. He said, oh, my biggest regret, my biggest mistake was not planning for the day after the Libya attack. You know? instead of not doing it in the first place, not planning for the day after, and nation building and rebuilding.
He should have called Hillary or read her emails. Maybe he could have found out. But one more before we close, and that has to do Russia. Russia's involved here. They were always a little bit involved, then they got involved very much. They thought they had improved things. They were working for a ceasefire, and they're around there, and they're not going to walk away from this. What do you think the odds are that they're going to be back? Do you think the conditions are going to deteriorate, that we're going to see the Russians bombing again? I wonder what the odds are of that happening, because that's going to be bad, because there's these weapons now, these shoulder-held missiles that they can shoot down airplanes, and it's already been done. This could really, just really get out of control.
Well, apparently the Russians have brought in, not to get too far into the weeds, but the Russians have brought in some helicopters that have some decent jamming technology to jam the electronics of these missiles. That may be one of the reasons why they pulled some of these planes out, which were maybe more vulnerable to them. But I would guess, just from looking at past Russian behavior, that they are going to be hesitant to come back in full force. I think they feel that they've achieved what mission they want. I think there'll be tactical strikes like they continue to do against Al-Qaeda and mostly ISIS. But I have a hard time believing that they will come back in full force unless things really go down and it looks like Assad's back on the ropes.
Well, that certainly would be better than all-out war, but the big question is what are we going to do? Do you think we're going to back off? Hardly. We're not likely to back off. We're sending more weapons in there because the foreign policy remains the same. It's a militant foreign policy of intervention. It's based on the assumption that we are responsible for the world at large, that we're the policemen of the world, and chaos would break out if we weren't there to bring about order. And all you have to do is look at the history and look at the Middle East. Chaos, follows our interventions. But it has not served our benefits. It costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of lives, and it costs a lot of friendships. And I just think that as we get ourselves into a much deeper economic crisis, the so-called friends and allies that we have won't be so close. Matter of fact, I think some of the people of some of the countries that are our close allies, whether they're German allies or French allies or British allies, that the people are probably closer to what we're talking about, and yet the governments are the ones who get us all into this trouble. So someday we should wake up, and if they're looking for a suggestion on what to do, how to extricate ourselves from that, face up to it. Do what we did in Vietnam. Admit we made a horrible, horrible mistake and stop the killing and bring our troops home. And yet the odds of that happening aren't very good. So I'm afraid this is going to linger. They don't have an exit strategy, but hopefully someday we'll have a generation that will grow up in this country who will say, it makes a whole lot of sense to have a non-intervention military policy and work toward friendship with all nations and trade with all nations, and that good things could come of it. The good things would be peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.